some boards are very flexible. They understand with sex assault and domestic violence that maybe they're not going to be working with law enforcement, but they're still a victim of crime, and so they will pay, right? And then the insurance thing won't be an issue. It's going to be very different depending on where you go, but if you can learn what your judicial district does, and if it's not the flexible kind, then perhaps you can open the door for ongoing conversation about why that would be really helpful to maybe be a little more flexible when it comes to sex assault and domestic violence.
Because there are so many issues surrounding it. And this case, like I said, this was a real case that we handled in our office, and sadly it's not the only one that I've had like this. And the student set up a payment plan and on her coffee shop job, and these bills come in and she goes into default and ends up in collections. But sometimes it's therapeutic for me because I can call bill collectors and okay, here's case number 2. This is another one that really happened. A civilian visits a military base and is sexually assaulted. The case is reported to military police and an investigation begins. The victim survivor receives a medical forensic exam off base at a local hospital. The hospital billing sends the bill for the medical forensic exam to the military, which refuses to pay. The hospital reaches out to us. The victim doesn't want to work with law enforcement. Initially it was reported, but after a while decides that she doesn't want to go ahead and cooperate or participate. So she receives the bills for the MFE and the associated costs. Then they reach out to us. Okay, who should pay?
DCJ.
Okay, why?
Because the victim, I'm assuming the civilian is not a dependent.
Excuse me?
The civilian is not a dependent in this
No.
example, right? So the military will only pay for people who are dependents or active duty or reserve or retired. So they won't pay for anybody that's not military.
Right, and even though it was reported to law enforcement, they are, what we learned, and this was very interesting, that the VAWA forensic compliance doesn't apply to the federal entities such as the military bases. So very good answer. And if the victim survivor is a civilian and doesn't work with military law enforcement on the investigation, then the state is obligated to pay by virtue of VAWA for the forensic compliance. If the victim or survivor was a member of the military, that's what you said, that they probably had TRICARE and it would have been paid for no matter how she reported, whether it was medical or anonymous or which route. So we ended up paying according to medical reporting protocol, which this really technically wasn't.
So Kathy,
Uh-huh.
so then a military victim who chooses not to report to military hospital, military law enforcement, DCJ will still pay for
Yeah, we
that?
would pay for them. Yeah, it would be the same kind of thing, unless it happened on a military base, or if he or she decided to turn it in to TRICARE, then I think TRICARE is the only, or it's generally the military insurance, but yeah, it would definitely come to us. We have another case study, or it can go on to
Yeah, there's a, we can move on.
Okay, now we have save case 3. And again, this was another real one. Sexual assault victim Jane Hill goes to Memorial Hospital for a SANE exam and treatment associated with injuries in February 2014. She wants the exam, but she doesn't want to report to law enforcement. Who should pay? Exactly. Later that same year, in July of 2014, Jane is again sexually assaulted. She returns to Memorial Hospital for the forensic exam and treatment. She still doesn't want to report to law enforcement. This is a totally different case, but she still doesn't want to participate in law enforcement. Who should pay? DCJ. In January of 2015, Jane experiences a third sexual assault. And this time she goes to Denver Health for a medical forensic exam and treatment. She decides again not to work with law enforcement. Who should pay? Exactly. It's too far. But yeah, we should We paid every time, and the point of that is to make sure that they know that they always have that option, that the survivor knows, and we have no idea what the situation of Jane is, why, if it's interpersonal or what is happening to her, but we want to make sure she just keeps coming in and takes care of herself and gets some treatment.
So per incident, not per person.
Right.
Okay, that's really important. It's not like a one-time deal, you get this payment and that's it. Obviously with repeated victimization, which we see, right? So it's important to know that. All right.
And back on the second Memorial Hospital, I did reach out to the nurse at Memorial just to make sure that they were reaching out, and she said that they were trying to get her some counseling and without going further and reporting to law enforcement, but just to try to work with her for her safety.
All right, so now we're going to shift into some reporting options. Those 3 options we went over earlier. So this first scenario, so we have a 40-year-old man who presents at a hospital ER. He has concussion and bruising and states that his partner caused the injuries. So he is seen by the ER physician. Upon the exam, the patient also discloses sexual assault perpetrated by the partner. He is then referred to a SANE, so sexual assault nurse examiner, for a medical forensic exam. He does want to have evidence collected, but is unsure about proceeding with the criminal justice system. So what are the reporting obligations in this scenario? Right, so for the domestic violence piece, note that as of August 9th, right, there's no longer a mandated report there, so a conversation should be happening between the medical provider and the patient around domestic violence support services and documenting their choice. What about with the sexual assault? What are the reporting options? All 3, right. Yes, because evidence is collected, that determines that there are those 3 options that are available to the survivor. So he could choose to work with law enforcement, he could choose to do medical reporting and just have evidence collected and provide his name, or he could be completely anonymous. If the person chooses medical or anonymous, SAVE would cover, and then the domestic violence piece that you talked about is that the referrals need to happen, but the DV piece is no longer a mandatory report. Right? Does that make sense? Okay.
He had been strangled.
Oh, I didn't mention strangulation. Oh gosh, yeah. Okay, so strangulation, thank you, Jessica. There is, whether or not strangulation falls into the category of serious bodily injury is undefined, right? And so you have a situation where, again, medical provider A might not be very educated on strangulation, may not know what to look for or understand that it could actually be life-threatening, and determine it's not a serious bodily injury, and then you could have medical provider B who could say, yes, strangulation is a serious bodily injury, and so I'm calling law enforcement, right? Thank you for bringing that up. So the strangulation piece, which is often present in domestic violence, becomes challenging in the medical arena based on provider interpretation, or indeed education around strangulation.
And CCADV now has something on their website, with a lot more information on this law to help. Yeah, they just put it up there.
Okay, so CCADV's website, ccadv.org, have just released technical assistance around this law because it can be a little tricky, the 1322 law. Okay, so we have a 19-year-old woman who goes to a public health department for STI testing. The patient tells the nurse practitioner that she was sexually assaulted 2 weeks ago, and she's worried that she has an STI as a result of the assault. So the nurse practitioner does a pelvic exam and a test for STIs. Is this a report to law enforcement mandated? No? No? Okay. Why? No, she doesn't have choices because she's not getting evidence collected, right? But so there's no evidence collected, so there's not choices, but there's also not a mandatory report, right? So those 3 choices, those 3 reporting options kick in when evidence is collected. So in this case, There's no mandatory report because there's not an injury being treated that's listed in the statute other than domestic violence. And the evidence isn't being collected, right? So you can work with college students who've experienced sexual assault. They can go to their health center on campus and have a pelvic exam, have an STI exam, and there's no reporting anything that kicks in. It's only if they were to go to a program and have evidence collected via a medical forensic exam that those three choices then come into play. Does that make sense? Okay. And in this case, payment for these services would be the patient's responsibility, either out of pocket or insurance, right? Okay, so number 3, so we have a 72-year-old patient who presents at a hospital, and this is following a sex assault perpetrated by her grandson's friend. She does not want law enforcement involved and doesn't want evidence collected, but she has significant vaginal bleeding and an injury that requires treatment. Can this patient obtain medical care without law enforcement being notified? So I'm seeing head shakes. Why? So because she's 70 years and older, absolutely. So law enforcement would have to be called. So because of the mandatory reporting of elderly abuse, the medical professional must contact law enforcement. If the patient changes her mind and consents to having evidence collected for the sex assault, she can still request to be a medical reporting victim. She can't be anonymous at this point, right? Because law enforcement have been called and been notified about the assault because she's 72 years old, but she can still be a medical reporting victim. And then the costs, those evidence collection and medical costs associated with the sex assault would be covered by SAVE. If she continues to say, no, I don't want evidence collected, then SAVE cannot cover any of those costs, right? She may or may not be eligible for victims' compensation based on how that plays out in terms of that mandatory report for elder abuse. And that would be down to the judicial district in which the victim's compensation is in, right? Because if she's not interested in working with law enforcement at all, but it's a mandatory report, there's a lot of gray area around what does that mean? Because law enforcement has been called without her consent, essentially. So now she's a victim of a crime, law enforcement knows about it, but what access does she have for payment of these medical costs that she's incurred because of this assault, right, because of this crime? All right, so that was a lot of information. Here are some implementation tools to help you with all of this. This one here was up there on the desk that may have been packed away, but this is a really handy-dandy reporting options brochure that CCASA produces that outlines those 3 reporting options that we talked about. It's designed for survivors, so it's really helpful if you have those in your offices. This here is the Colorado Sexual Assault Evidence Collection Protocol, and this is on the Same Safe Project website, which is out of Memorial Hospital in Colorado Springs, and they create protocols for evidence collection for both victims and perpetrators. So if you have interest in reading what that protocol looks like for the actual, the process of the exam, you can go there. And then this one should be winging its way to an email near you sometime in the very near future. It is our guidelines for response document that has been in progress for what feels like a decade. We just had to update it with the new domestic violence laws, and so it was delayed with the release, but it is a step-by-step guide around reporting options, who pays, what does advocacy look like, how to work with folks from different populations, when to bill insurance, when not. It's just got everything in it. It's 70 pages, and it's awesome and robust, and I encourage you to read it when it finds its way to you, and please provide it to your colleagues. There's a lot of people put a lot of work into that. And then there's some other websites on there that could be helpful to you. Kathy, do you have anything you would like to add?
One thing that Lisa and I had discussed earlier about with regard to college students. If you have a college student, and this seems like this is the crowd to talk to, if you have a college student who is sexually assaulted, does go to the medical facility on campus, and is treated and cleared, and then goes on to Denver Health for the same exam. What happens to those costs from the campus healthcare center? Is that included in student fees? Yes.
Yeah, our whole career center won't charge folks, they just don't charge them.
Okay, so that survivor wouldn't get a specific bill, it's just kind of across the board?
Yeah, so that was
Okay.
a part, I think, due to relationship on
Yeah, I think that's something that to check, right? Because if you have a survivor who gets care at a medical center on your campus, then goes to get the exam, but there's no feedback loop that then lets the health center know that you shouldn't be billing the patient for the initial costs. You should be billing either, they should have victims comp or it should be DCJ. Like if that loop doesn't get closed, then it's possible that you could, if they're not writing off the costs, if that conversation hasn't happened, then you're going to have a campus medical center who is going to bill that patient, or which could lead to a hold on a student's account because they have these charges that appear on their bill, right? So that's just something to think about.
Well, and it's not only the bill, but then you're interfering with chain of evidence too. If you get something done there before going to the scene, so that actually becomes part of chain of evidence that's usually requested by police. What we do at our campus is if someone walks in and they've started to disclose any type of PV or sex assault, the medical provider says hold and brings in a confidential advocate from my office to go over all of their medical options, so then they can make an informed decision before any charges even happen, and then they know about their options.
Good.
And make a more informed decision.
Yeah, that would be the ideal way. And we were discussing whether perhaps a patient might come in having a panic attack because she's just been sexually assaulted but doesn't disclose the assault and is treated for the panic attack, then I guess that's a whole different
Right, so they-
situation.
Climate action.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so just ensuring that you're having conversations with your medical providers on your campus medical center around these scenarios, right? Yeah, because that's the other place is that there isn't a disclosure of sex assault. They're just treated for ABC and then later they go to get an exam, but it's connected, right? So they shouldn't be billed for it. But if that loop isn't closed, or if there isn't permission or consent given to go back to the medical facility and say this was associated with an assault, please bill DCJ, please, like there's all these kind of like if, buts, whens, and maybes associated with reporting a sex assault and who should pay and when and why. And Kathy is a great, great resource if you have questions around whether or not SAVE can or should do anything about costs.
And our contact information is listed in your handout. Are there other questions?
So that last scenario brought up a question for me. The SAVE program doesn't consider treatment costs associated with sexual assault unless a safe kit is cracked. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, and then that gets sometimes a little gray. We had a bill for photographic evidence,
Okay.
or like pictures taken, but then they didn't have the exam, the forensic exam. We did pay for that, but it's tied to evidence collection.
I see.
And so that's where it gets a little bit gray, but generally it's all, if somebody just goes in and they don't have any part of the exam done, we can't pay for it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So if a victim decides to have a forensic exam and cooperate with law enforcement, and then midway through decides to stop the exam and evidence collection, is law enforcement still responsible because they initially reported to law enforcement?
If it's during the exam, I mean, yeah, and if it's during the exam, I would say we could make it a case that they were medically reporting before the exam is concluded. But the problem comes in is that patient who is cooperating, and this happens quite often, that 4 days later or 2 weeks later decides I don't want to do this. We can't pay for it, and then it goes back to those judicial districts whether they will pay for those extra costs or not. The law enforcement is always responsible for the medical forensic exam itself, and they can run anywhere from about 400 to 900, depending on the facility. But the law enforcement would have to pay it, but all those extra costs, those are the ones that rack up, and victims come may or may not pay for it.
But mid-exam, the exam has not been completed, the evidence collection is not finished, and they change their mind, it would bump to medical or abuse.
I would say that,
Okay. But if evidence collection is finished, if that's over and they've left,
and they,
it
yeah,
would stay with law enforcement. Even if it was like 5 hours after they had been at the hospital and had the evidence
yeah,
collected.
they were reporting at the time. And law enforcement, and it's hard on some of these little law enforcement agencies, that Delta County Sheriff, or that's their budget oftentimes, that they get a couple of sex assaults and an investigation doesn't continue, but they still are responsible for paying for those, and we understand that you can't pay anyway.
The only person that gets to decide whether a medical forensic exam happens is the survivor, is the patient, right? No one else can decide that. The best practice time frame for a medical forensic exam is 5 days. But let's say 10 days has passed and the survivor still wants a medical forensic exam, then a medical forensic exam will happen, right? Because it's their choice, they get to choose that, and it would be covered per what we talked about in terms of the costs. The law enforcement agent tries to dissuade the survivor from having an exam, however subtle, that is a violation of Colorado state law.
Yeah, and sadly it happens. I'd like to think that it doesn't happen as often anymore. In terms of more education, and then it wouldn't happen, but sadly it still does. And I sometimes will have arguments with some of our bigger law enforcement agencies, not Denver, say that right out, but they say, no, she changed her mind, so it's yours. And, no, it's yours. So, play a little hot potato sometimes with that.
Other questions? All right, great.
Well, thank you for sticking
Really
with us.